Judge tries to sentence black woman unfairly, then shocked finds out she's the governor's chief legal advisor. Welcome, dear viewers, to a story that weaves suspense, drama, and a stunning revelation into one unforgettable tapestry of justice. In a quiet Michigan courtroom, an ambitious judge dares to wield his power without mercy, assuming that no one would dare challenge his authority. Little does he know, the woman standing before him is no ordinary citizen. Beneath her calm exterior lies a wealth of legal expertise and the unwavering support of the state's most powerful office. In this riveting tale, hidden agendas collide, shocking truths emerge, and hearts race with every twist and turn. Prepare to be astonished as you witness how a single courtroom showdown can topple the mighty and awaken a nation. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're excited about this story, let us know. If you enjoyed the video, press 1. If not, press O. Your feedback really inspires me to gather more uplifting and meaningful stories. Inside the hallowed halls of the Lansing courthouse, whispers and hurried footsteps echoed against the marble walls. Court staff exchanged uneasy glances as Judge Richard Hollingsworth, renowned for his stern demeanor and harsh rulings, prepared to hear a new case. His reputation for arrogance and barely veiled bias was known throughout Michigan's legal circles. Some claimed he ruled with an iron fist, especially when the defendant happened to be from a marginalized background. Others said he was merely firm but fair. Yet, those closest to the system and to him understood the dangerous brand of hubris that guided his decisions. On that crisp Monday morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Attorneys scurried about, bundling documents, adjusting ties, and making last-minute calls before the session began. The corridor outside Courtroom 7 was filled with a diverse group of spectators, each with their own reason for attending. Some were reporters hoping for a sensational headline, while others were law students visiting from Michigan State University to witness legal proceedings in real time. Rumors drifted among them that this particular hearing was unremarkable, just another defendant facing sentencing for what looked like a minor misdemeanor. Little did they know that the woman about to stand before Judge Hollingsworth was more than just a number on his docket. She was a figure whose name, in the right circles, carried immense weight. But for now, she remained just another quiet face, shrouded in the unassuming grace of someone accustomed to scrutiny, yet confident in her own path. As the bailiff announced the case of State of Michigan v. Alia Brooks, no one could have guessed that this nondescript proceeding would soon escalate into a drama that would shake the entire state. The judge's glare settled on Alia Brooks the moment she approached the defense table. He leaned forward, fingers interlaced, exuding an air of unchallengeable authority. Hollingsworth's carefully coiffed grey hair, sharp robes, and pointed expression were, by now, all too familiar to the courtroom regulars. Alia, however, was the picture of poise. Dressed in a dark blue pencil skirt and matching blazer, she moved with the confidence of someone who had navigated countless corridors of power before. Her eyes calmly took in the surroundings, and not once did she let her surprise or discomfort show. She maintained a measured distance from the public defender who stood beside her, visibly flustered by the judge's intense scrutiny. The moment the case was called, the prosecution wasted no time painting Alia as a woman with questionable integrity. They accused her of violating an obscure local ordinance, something about unauthorized practice in a private capacity that had allegedly cost a local business thousands of dollars. The details were murky, and though it sounded petty, the prosecutor delivered each word with theatrical gravitas, as though Alia were a high-profile criminal. Judge Hollingsworth's eyes gleamed with a strange anticipation. Every attorney in the room recognized the flicker behind his gaze. It was the look he often wore when he believed he had cornered his next victim. Yet, he knew nothing of Alia's background. To him, she was likely just another defendant from a disadvantaged community he could reprimand. The crowd watched intently, unaware that a storm was quietly brewing beneath the surface of this seemingly routine hearing. As the prosecutor droned on about Alia's alleged violation, he introduced a string of petty witnesses: a small shop owner, a cashier, and a local code enforcement officer who claimed to have seen Alia operating outside her legal boundaries. The story sounded suspiciously thin. Yet, to the untrained ear, these carefully orchestrated testimonies might weave a damning narrative. The defense attorney, apparently assigned at the last minute, fidgeted nervously. He had never handled a case under such intense scrutiny from the judge, and his client seemed far more composed than he was. The hush in the gallery was so thick you could almost hear hearts beating. As each witness spoke, the tension escalated, leaving everyone with the impression that something bigger lay beneath this case. A few reporters began to shuffle uncomfortably in their seats, sensing there might be more to report than they had initially assumed. Alia's demeanor offered no clues. She sat straight-backed, her expression revealing neither fear nor outrage. Occasionally, her gaze drifted over to the prosecution with a quiet intensity, as though sizing them up. She took notes diligently, whispering a few words to her defense attorney here and there. The judge, however, seemed immune to her calm. He appeared almost smug, as if tasting his impending triumph. No one knew the exact moment that things would shift, but those who were seasoned in the theater of the courtroom could sense a simmering tension about to boil over. The case reeked of an ulterior motive, yet it remained to be seen who was orchestrating the spectacle behind the scenes. The pivotal shift came when the prosecution attempted to introduce evidence that seemed bafflingly irrelevant. They called an additional witness, who claimed to have personal knowledge of Alia's activities. A middle-aged woman with a look of grim satisfaction stepped forward, introducing herself as a local community leader who had once clashed with Alia in a regulatory dispute. But as she began testifying, her stories grew increasingly bizarre. She claimed that Alia had utilized her connections to undermine local ordinances, that she had flaunted her supposed legal expertise, and that she was intimidating city officials. Yet, all these allegations were without concrete documentation. The witness spoke with unwavering confidence, but she offered no legitimate proof. A hush spread through the courtroom. Even some of the spectators who had been content to remain passive began to whisper among themselves. The notion that Alia might be more influential than originally thought now hung in the air. Judge Hollingsworth smirked, eyes narrowing at the suggestion that Alia had hidden any powerful connections. Instead of probing the testimony for truth, the judge seemed ready to swallow the allegations whole, weaponizing them against Alia to justify a harsher sentence. The entire situation felt orchestrated, like a carefully staged play meant to manipulate the outcome. In that moment, one could almost see the flicker of cunning in Hollingsworth's eyes. It was the look of a man who sensed an opportunity, the chance to make an example of someone who, in his view, dared to stand above her place. Little did he realize that he had unwittingly stepped into a trap far more elaborate than the one he believed he was weaving. Alia's defense attorney finally found his footing. Turning toward the witness, he methodically dismantled her claims, exposing inconsistencies in her timeline and pointing out the glaring lack of documentation. Yet, each time he tried to press further, the judge intervened with curt objections that favored the prosecution. Whispers of dismay trickled through the courtroom as it became evident that something was off. The balance of justice seemed perilously tilted. Meanwhile, Alia watched the proceedings with a calm patience that baffled onlookers. Her expression never broke. It was as though she expected every maneuver, every twist, every forced objection that the judge hurled against her attorney's attempts to establish the truth. Her silence wasn't passive. It felt strategic, poised. A slight tremor ran through the public defender's hands as he flipped through his notes, determined to present a coherent defense. Hollingsworth, however, had other plans. With every response from the defense, the judge cut them short, offering clipped dismissals. Observers noticed the pattern. He was orchestrating a legal environment in which no real defense could be mounted. He was practically ushering Alia down the path of guilt. At one point, the judge glared directly at Alia. "You should have thought about the consequences of your actions," he sneered. The words bristled with condescension, reverberating through the silent courtroom. Even the reporters took notice. They began typing more fervently, sensing that something major could erupt from this otherwise small-scale hearing. The tension in the air thickened, fueling the sense of imminent revelation. And still, Alia remained stoic, as if waiting for the perfect moment to speak. Then came the moment that changed everything. The prosecution wrapped up its questionable testimony, and the judge, with apparent eagerness, signaled for the defense to present any final statements. Alia's attorney stood, ready to speak, but she gently placed a hand on his shoulder and rose to address the court herself. The crowd collectively held its breath. "Your Honor," Alia began, her voice resonating with a measured confidence that captured everyone's attention. "I respect the process of this court, but I must clarify a few key points that have been misconstrued." The judge's face hardened, but he didn't interrupt. Perhaps he wished to relish watching her flounder. However, as Alia spoke, a ripple of shock spread across the courtroom. She meticulously dissected each accusation, referencing specific legal statutes, citing precedents from cases like People v. Anderson and City of Lansing v. Fitzgerald, and pointing out the glaring holes in the prosecution's evidence. Her mastery of the law was evident in every word, every subtle shift of legal jargon that the average person might miss. Spectators realized that she was no ordinary defendant. Even the defense attorney looked at her with a mixture of awe and confusion. How did she have such intimate knowledge of these obscure legal references? The judge tried to maintain his composure, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. As Alia continued, a slow murmur built in the gallery. She was dismantling the prosecution's arguments with surgical precision, leaving no room for doubt that the charges were misleading at best and manufactured at worst. And still, the most shocking revelation lay in wait, like a lion poised to pounce. Just when it seemed her defense couldn't be more thorough, Alia took a pause. She scanned the courtroom, eyes lingering on the press, the law students, and the stoic judge looming on his bench. Then, in a quiet yet firm voice, she delivered the bombshell. "There's one other matter I must address before this court, given the judge's evident partiality and the prosecution's blatant disregard for proper procedure." She reached into her blazer, producing a letter embossed with the seal of the office of the Governor of Michigan. "I happen to serve this state in a capacity that demands I not remain silent when justice is abused." The room went silent. One could practically hear hearts pounding. Judge Hollingsworth's upper lip twitched in a barely restrained frown. The prosecutor's gaze darted nervously from the letter to the judge, sensing a disaster in the making. Without looking away from Hollingsworth, Alia laid the letter on the defense table. "I am the chief legal advisor to Governor Samantha Pearson of Michigan. This trial and your conduct, Your Honor, reflect poorly on the integrity of our legal system." A jolt of electricity shot through the onlookers. Suddenly, the entire narrative shifted. The woman the judge had treated like an insignificant defendant turned out to be one of the highest-ranking legal minds in the state. Reporters scrambled for their phones and pens, capturing every detail for what would surely be front-page news. Judge Hollingsworth's eyes widened, and for a split second, fear flashed in them. He tried to mask it behind outrage, but his expression betrayed him. The once confident figure behind the bench was visibly rattled. A hush blanketed the gallery, everyone bracing for the judge's response and for the aftershocks of this monumental revelation. What followed next was a symphony of gasps, muttered exclamations, and the frantic clicking of cameras. A wave of astonishment swept across the courtroom as people grappled with the implications of Alia's declaration. The silence stretched taut, pregnant with the promise of chaos and retribution. Even the bailiff, who normally stared impassively, seemed caught off guard. Judge Hollingsworth cleared his throat, attempting to regain the facade of composure, but the veneer was cracked. "Order in the court," he barked, his voice wavering slightly. He glowered at Alia. "I will not tolerate theatrics in my courtroom. This is highly irregular." Alia's eyes never left his. "What's truly irregular, Your Honor, is your disregard for due process. I have watched as you curtailed my defense counsel's right to cross-examine witnesses and admitted evidence with no legitimate foundation. My position as chief legal advisor to the governor is not our theatric, but a fact that underscores the gravity of your misconduct." A ripple of admiration passed through the onlookers. More than just a shocking revelation, Alia's stance was a direct challenge to a judge who had grown accustomed to unchecked authority. Meanwhile, the prosecution squirmed, papers rustling in a desperate search for some angle to mitigate the disaster unfolding before their eyes. Hollingsworth attempted to bluster, his face reddening. "This court has the discretion to run proceedings as it sees fit. I will not be lectured on my duties." In that moment it was clear the scales of power had shifted. No longer was Alia a lone defendant facing an uphill battle. She was a formidable force, backed by the state's highest office, and her unwavering stand would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The uproar in the courthouse lobby after the session adjourned was immediate and deafening. Reporters from the Lansing State Journal and the local NBC affiliate jostled for space, hoping to catch a word with Alia as she exited. A throng of curious law students, onlookers, and even a few staff members peppered her with questions. But Alia offered little. She simply reiterated that she had faith in a fair judicial system and would speak more after the verdict. The judge had hastily called for a recess, presumably to gather his wits. In the corridor, the prosecutor appeared to be in deep discussion with his colleagues, faces tense. The orchestrated farce they had staged was unraveling spectacularly. Meanwhile, a different kind of tension brewed in a nearby conference room where a clandestine meeting was taking place. Judge Hollingsworth had retreated there with a few city officials known to be under his influence. According to whispers that spread like wildfire, he was furious, demanding an explanation for how they had overlooked the defendant's true identity. The door was locked, but muffled shouting leaked out a potent sign that the once confident judge was in full panic mode. When Alia's defense attorney approached her with wide eyes, breathless, she simply offered a reassuring smile. Though the attorney was relieved to learn her true status, he couldn't help but marvel at the elaborate ruse. "You could have told me sooner," he managed to say, half-jokingly. Alia apologized gently, explaining that she hadn't anticipated such a blatant miscarriage of justice. Outside, camera crews zoomed in, capturing every detail of this burgeoning scandal. Citizens who had come for mundane legal errands found themselves watching a real-life drama unfold, one that would have ramifications far beyond a single courtroom. As the story broke, news outlets exploded with coverage. By midday, the Detroit Free Press and even USA Today had picked up the story, Judge attempts to sentence governor's chief legal advisor, accusations of judicial misconduct. Fly in Lansing. Social media went wild. Hashtags like hashtag Michigan Justice, hashtag legal scandal, and hashtag check the judge trended regionally, then nationally. At the governor's mansion, Samantha Pearson was briefed by her communications team. Known for her commitment to transparency and justice, the governor was incensed. She immediately called an emergency meeting with top aides, demanding a full review of Hollingsworth's judicial history. Not surprisingly, they found a trail of questionable verdicts disproportionately impacting minority defendants. Rumors swirled that a formal investigation would soon be launched. Within the corridors of power, Aaliyah's colleagues were equally stunned. Many knew she was dedicated to rooting out corruption in the legal system, but few had realized just how close to home the problem lay. They offered her words of support, yet also cautioned powerful men do not often relinquish their thrones without a fight. Meanwhile, Judge Hollingsworth was far from conceding. Behind closed doors, he plotted ways to salvage his reputation. He reached out to political allies, calling in old favors. Some speculated he would paint Aaliyah's revelation as a political stunt orchestrated by the governor's office. Others believed he might dig into her past to find any misstep he could exploit. A whirlwind of tension and uncertainty cloaked the state. In coffee shops, libraries, and barbershops, people argued passionately over the scandal. Citizens who had long felt marginalized by the justice system saw a flicker of hope. If the judge were held accountable, maybe their own silent struggles would finally receive the attention they deserved. Yet, a question loomed: could Aaliyah, even with her high-profile position, truly bring down a judge as entrenched as Hollingsworth? Before the next court session, a flurry of legal maneuvers took place. Hollingsworth issued a sudden order restricting media presence in his courtroom, citing concerns about unnecessary spectacle. It was an unprecedented move that ignited further controversy. Many questioned what he was trying to hide. The Michigan State Bar Association released a statement expressing concern over the judge's attempt to clamp down on public scrutiny. As legal experts pointed out, transparency is a cornerstone of justice. When the trial resumed, a smaller group of journalists was allowed inside, but they were carefully vetted and placed under strict guidelines. Aaliyah arrived surrounded by a cadre of supporters, including some from the governor's team, though the governor herself refrained from making an appearance, at least not yet. The tension in the building crackled like static electricity. Hollingsworth sat high on his bench, face impassive, as though daring someone to challenge him. He briefly acknowledged Aaliyah's status as chief legal advisor, but insisted that the case would proceed. The defense attorney argued for a mistrial, citing judicial bias. Hollingsworth promptly dismissed the motion, claiming there was no evidence he had shown bias. The absurdity of the statement was not lost on those in attendance. Aaliyah said little. She believed the judge was inching toward a grave he was digging for himself. She needed only to let him carry on. Yet an undercurrent of dread wove through her thoughts. She was aware that men like Hollingsworth often had powerful connections. Was he truly alone in this vendetta, or were bigger forces at play? Despite the uneasy calm, the seeds of a broader confrontation were sprouting. Members of the public demanded an investigation. The state attorney general's office hinted they might get involved if credible misconduct allegations surfaced. And so, each participant in this unfolding drama stepped warily, knowing that one misstep could trigger an avalanche. During a brief recess, Aaliyah found herself in the courthouse cafeteria, nursing a cup of coffee. The typically bustling space had quieted to hushed conversations as employees, attorneys, and even a few witnesses discreetly gawked at her. She tried to ignore the stares, focusing on her phone as she scrolled through messages from colleagues offering support or requesting details. It was then that an unexpected visitor approached, a young law clerk named Daniel, who worked for Judge Hollingsworth. He was visibly nervous, glancing around to ensure no one overheard him. He introduced himself in a voice just above a whisper, confessing that he was troubled by what he'd seen unfolding in chambers. He admitted he had overheard the judge making disparaging remarks, not just about Aliyah, but about people like her. The context was crystal clear. Aliyah studied the trembling clerk, his eyes brimmed with sincerity, tempered by fear of retaliation. She gently pressed for specifics. Hesitant at first, Daniel told her that earlier that morning the judge had warned staff that if they leaked confidential discussions, they would face severe consequences. According to Daniel, those so-called confidential discussions included vile insinuations and an expressed intention to hand down the harshest possible sentence to make an example of Aliyah despite the shaky charges. Her pulse quickened with anger, but she kept her composure. She had known the judge was biased, but hearing it spelled out so blatantly fueled her resolve. She assured the clerk that if he brought his concerns to the proper authorities, she and her colleagues at the governor's office would protect him from reprisals. Daniel thanked her, though the anxiety never left his face. Aliyah returned to the courtroom with a renewed determination. She now possessed insider information that could prove crucial if the system chose to open a formal investigation into Hollingsworth. The judge might have powerful allies, but Aliyah was not alone, and the scales of justice were beginning to tilt in her favor. In the days that followed, a quiet but thorough investigation began to take shape behind the scenes. Aliyah discreetly relayed Daniel's statements to the governor's internal legal team, who in turn coordinated with the Attorney General's office. They combed through Hollingsworth's past rulings, searching for patterns of bias or unethical conduct. Sure enough, anomalies began to surface: disproportionate sentences for Black and Latino defendants, abrupt dismissal of motions from defense attorneys, and an alarming frequency of conflicts of interest. Simultaneously, the judge's allies launched a counter-offensive. Anonymous op-eds appeared in the local papers, accusing Aliyah of weaponizing her position for personal gain. A shadowy political action committee began airing negative ads, questioning her integrity, insinuating that she was using the justice system to further Governor Pearson's agenda. It was a classic smear campaign designed to tarnish her reputation and cast doubt on the scandal swirling around Hollingsworth. For Aliyah, the pressure was immense. On top of the stress of the ongoing trial, where the judge continued to brazenly show favoritism toward the prosecution, she now had to contend with the court of public opinion. Threatening letters made their way into her mailbox, urging her to back down. Someone even leaked her personal contact information online, prompting a barrage of hostile messages. But she remained undeterred. Each attack only reinforced her conviction. With a team of skilled attorneys in the governor's office, she pressed forward. Evidence was compiled, sworn affidavits collected, and a timeline of Hollingsworth's alleged misconduct pieced together. Soon, rumblings of a possible impeachment, or at least a forced resignation, circulated in state political circles. Even as the tension soared, the final face-off drew near, the day when Judge Hollingsworth would be forced to deliver a verdict or dismiss the case altogether. The world watched with bated breath to see if justice would prevail, or if a corrupted system would once again shield one of its own. The morning of the verdict was grey and windy in Lansing, as though the city itself braced for a storm. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, holding signs demanding justice and chanting slogans urging Hollingsworth to recuse himself. Across the street, a smaller counter-protest insisted that the judge was being framed, claiming Aliyah and the governor were orchestrating a witch hunt. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Inside, security was tighter than ever. Police officers stood at every corner, searching bags and monitoring the corridors. Aaliyah took her seat at the defense table, her posture unyielding. Beside her was the anxious public defender, who had grown increasingly outspoken about Hollingsworth's conduct. In the gallery, seats were filled with lawyers, activists, law students, and journalists, each anticipating a moment that could go down in Michigan's legal history. Judge Hollingsworth strode into the courtroom, robes billowing. His expression was implacable, but a subtle tick in his jaw suggested the strain he was under. He wasted no time, calling the session to order and announcing that he would deliver a decision regarding the alleged violation on which Aaliyah had been charged. The hush was absolute. In a move that shocked no one familiar with his biases, Hollingsworth declared Aaliyah guilty. He cited flimsy legal reasoning, dismissing or ignoring every counter-argument she had presented. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but the judge banged his gavel to silence them. In the next breath, he prepared to pronounce sentencing, a sentence that, if rumors were to be believed, would far exceed the norm for such a minor offense. Then, something extraordinary happened. One of the doors near the back swung open, and a figure stepped inside, flanked by aides and security personnel. The entire room turned as Governor Samantha Pearson herself walked down the aisle, her gaze fixed on the judge, her posture radiating quiet fury. Hollingsworth paused, gavel frozen mid-air. The stunned silence that followed was so profound it seemed to suspend time. A flurry of motion erupted as reporters scrambled to capture photos and footage of the governor's entrance. Hollingsworth stood paralyzed, as if confronted by a ghost he never expected to see. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The governor had come in person to witness the final moments of this trial. Governor Pearson, composed yet visibly incensed, locked eyes with Hollingsworth. In a measured voice that resonated with authority, she asked to be recognized by the court. The judge hesitated, then grudgingly granted permission, aware that refusing would create an even bigger scandal. "I've come today as a private citizen and as governor," she began, "to observe a proceeding that many in this state believe to be unjust. I also have information that bears directly on the conduct of this court." The tension was so thick one could almost taste it. Hollingsworth tried to interject, but Pearson continued, undeterred. She announced that the Attorney General had authorized an official investigation into allegations of judicial misconduct against Hollingsworth. She calmly listed the growing evidence, including sworn statements from Daniel, the law clerk, and others who had come forward anonymously, describing intimidation and discriminatory remarks. Additionally, she presented a summary of the judge's dubious rulings that pointed to a pattern of racial bias. "If you proceed with sentencing Miss Brooks in this manner," the governor said, "you may be held in contempt of the very laws you vowed to uphold. I strongly recommend you consider your next steps carefully." A hushed awe settled over the courtroom. No one could recall witnessing a moment like this, where a sitting governor directly confronted a judge with allegations of corruption in open court. Hollingsworth's complexion paled, anger flickering behind his eyes. He realized that not only was his reputation at stake, but potentially his entire career. The power he had wielded so freely now slipped through his fingers like sand. For a protracted moment, no one dared to speak. The bailiff looked to the judge, uncertain whether to demand the governor leave the courtroom. Hollingsworth's fists tightened on the edge of his bench, his face contorted with a storm of emotion: outrage, fear, defiance. The meticulously cultivated power structure that had protected him for years was dissolving before his eyes. Finally, in a voice taut with fury, Hollingsworth announced a recess. He rose so abruptly that his chair nearly toppled over. Striding from the bench, he retreated to his chambers, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Governor Pearson exhaled slowly, then moved to Aaliyah's side. Cameras flashed from every corner, capturing the moment the state's top official openly expressed solidarity with the defendant and her own chief legal advisor. As soon as Hollingsworth disappeared, the gallery erupted in conversation. Reporters rushed to their phones to file urgent updates, while others clamored to interview the governor. Aaliyah gently declined immediate comment, citing the ongoing nature of the case, but her relief was evident in the faint smile that crossed her face. This was a rare show of support that could turn the tide completely. In the hallway, the prosecutor slumped against the wall, looking like someone whose final, desperate gambit had just been called out. He scurried away from waiting journalists, refusing to answer questions about his role in the suspect case against Aaliyah. Meanwhile, a cluster of law students buzzed with excitement, some even celebrating the real-time takedown of a possibly corrupt judge. But the fight was not over yet. A recess did not mean resolution. Hollingsworth could attempt to salvage his position, or he might refuse to acknowledge the newly uncovered evidence. The next hour would be decisive, potentially the final showdown between unbridled arrogance and the rule of law. Everyone remained on edge, bracing for what the judge would do next. The tension in the courthouse corridors was almost unbearable during the recess. Officials whispered in hushed clusters, glancing nervously at the clock. Rumors swirled about what might be happening behind Hollingsworth's closed doors. Some speculated he was making frantic calls to political connections. Others believed he might be in meltdown mode, aware that an avalanche of scrutiny was about to bury him. Inside a small meeting room, Aaliyah, Governor Pearson, and a handful of legal advisors huddled. The governor spoke quietly but firmly, explaining her next steps. She intended to file a formal complaint with the State Judicial Tenure Commission, and the Attorney General's office was standing by to pursue charges if credible evidence of misconduct emerged. Aaliyah offered her thanks, though she insisted that her own personal vindication was only part of the goal. There are countless others, she reminded them. He's made a habit of imposing unfair sentences on marginalized people for years. I want justice for them, too. Pearson placed a reassuring hand on Aaliyah's shoulder, promising that her administration would not rest until the systematic injustice was addressed. The two women shared a look of mutual resolve that transcended their official roles. It was a moment of human connection, a vow to champion those who lacked the power to defend themselves. When the recess ended, everyone filed back into the courtroom. The atmosphere was rife with expectation. Hollingsworth was nowhere to be seen. Minutes ticked by, turning into nearly half an hour past the scheduled resumption time. Restless murmurs spread through the gallery. Where was the judge? Then, suddenly, the door leading to the judge's chambers slammed open. Hollingsworth emerged, his face set in grim determination. He ascended the bench without meeting anyone's gaze. Clearing his throat, he declared in a stiff voice that he was postponing sentencing pending a review of procedural propriety. While it was not the clean exoneration many hoped for, it was clear that he had blinked first in this high-stakes standoff. For a man so unwilling to yield power, it was a significant concession and, likely, an omen of his downfall. Following Hollingsworth's abrupt decision to postpone sentencing, the courtroom emptied in a swirl of confusion. Aaliyah's immediate ordeal was not conclusively resolved, but this delay felt like a victory. People on the steps outside the courthouse described the scene as surreal, a top judge forced into retreat by the unwavering stance of a single individual bolstered by the governor's support. Cameramen and reporters jockeyed for vantage points, capturing every reaction. News vans lined the street, broadcasting live updates. Interviews with legal experts underscored the significance of a sitting judge, essentially acknowledging that his procedures might not hold up under scrutiny. Speculation ran rampant about the next steps. Would Hollingsworth step down to avoid humiliation? Would the Judicial Tenure Commission suspend him pending investigation? Or would he dig in and fight a war he seemed destined to lose? Within the hour, the governor's communications team released a statement confirming the formal complaint against Hollingsworth. That statement rattled through the state's political landscape, prompting calls for an emergency session of the Legislative Judiciary Committee to examine the judge's conduct. The attorneys general from neighboring states even weighed in, some praising Alia's courage. At the center of the media frenzy, Alia found a moment of stillness. Tucked away in a quiet corner of the courthouse, she let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for weeks. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages of support and interview requests. Even the public defender, who'd been so timid at the start, now appeared emboldened, openly condemning the systemic failings that allowed Hollingsworth to thrive. Yet, amid the euphoria of shifting power, Alia's thoughts returned to her core mission. She was determined not just to clear her name, but to expose the structural inequalities that made such abuses possible in the first place. Her personal stand was becoming a clarion call for broader change, and she felt a deep sense of responsibility to see it through, no matter how many twists lay ahead. As the days rolled by, the fallout intensified. Hollingsworth became the target of multiple investigations that went beyond Alia's case. Former defendants stepped forward with their own horror stories, allegations of racism, extortion, and judicial overreach. Local advocacy groups organized forums where these stories were shared publicly, amplifying the demand for the judge's removal. The scandal ballooned, overshadowing nearly every other political topic in Michigan. Behind the scenes, Alia juggled her responsibilities at the governor's office with her newly minted role as a focal point for reform. She attended meetings at the Capitol, advising on potential legislation aimed at curbing judicial misconduct and increasing accountability. Colleagues mentioned that her once low-profile position had skyrocketed in visibility. Some even jokingly remarked that she should consider running for higher office. Alia would laugh it off, saying she had her hands full just ensuring one bad judge faced justice. Meanwhile, Governor Pearson made a public address. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, she condemned any form of racial bias within Michigan's judiciary, vowing to root it out wherever it flourished. She emphasized that this was not about targeting one individual out of vindictiveness, but about restoring faith in the courts. The speech resonated widely, winning praise from civil rights organizations and everyday citizens alike. Yet, in the midst of mounting pressure, Hollingsworth still clung to his gavel. He refused to resign, and through surrogates, he launched a desperate media blitz, painting himself as a victim of political sabotage. The ads declared that radical elements were undermining the rule of law. Some members of his local community, who had benefited from his favoritism, rallied to his defense, claiming that his downfall would mark an erosion of traditional values. But the walls were closing in. The State Judicial Tenure Commission announced it was expediting its investigation. Rumors swirled that official subpoenas had been issued for court staff, local officials, and even the judge's family members. A date was set for a public hearing, a rare step that signified the gravity of the allegations. And in the eye of this storm stood Alia, unwavering, her resolve forging a path toward a day of reckoning. The day of the Judicial Tenure Commission hearing arrived with an undercurrent of foreboding. Held in the same courthouse where Hollingsworth had once reigned supreme, the proceeding drew an immense crowd. Television crews set up outside, capturing a line of witnesses and officials queued to testify. Inside the main chamber, a panel of legal experts sat behind a long table, solemn expressions betraying the significance of the event. The judge, accompanied by a small team of attorneys, took a seat facing the panel. He looked noticeably older, the strain of the recent weeks etched into the lines of his face. Despite that, he maintained an air of defiance, occasionally casting glaring looks at the audience. One by one, witnesses came forward. Some recounted experiences that made the gallery gasp. A mother describing how Hollingsworth had doubled her son's sentence based on a technicality, a local pastor recounting hateful remarks allegedly made in the judge's private chambers, and a lawyer who'd been sanctioned for challenging Hollingsworth's unorthodox rulings. Then came Daniel, the law clerk, who bravely repeated the damning statements he had heard just before Aaliyah's trial. Hollingsworth's defense tried to poke holes in each testimony, questioning motives and credibility. But the evidence mounted. Photos emerged of lavish gifts from wealthy defendants, along with the judge's suspicious financial statements. Each revelation chipped away at his once imposing aura. Aaliyah sat quietly near the back. She watched Hollingsworth's composure unravel with each new piece of evidence. At times, anger flared on his face, as though outraged he was being forced to justify himself to others. It was a stark contrast to the man who had once smirked from the bench, so sure of his untouchable status. By late afternoon, it was her turn to testify. The room fell silent as she walked to the front, took the oath, and delivered a concise but powerful account of her encounter with Hollingsworth. She recounted how he had disregarded her rights, admitted questionable evidence, and effectively orchestrated a conviction before the trial even began. She spoke not just for herself, but for every defendant who had suffered under that same gavel. When she finished, the hush in the room was profound, tinged with a collective sense that the reckoning was near. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered to listen to live coverage broadcast through speakers and streamed on social media. Advocates for judicial reform cheered each time a new testimony underscored Hollingsworth's misconduct. Counter-protesters tried to disrupt the proceedings, chanting that the judge was being framed, but their voices were drowned out by the momentum shifting decisively toward accountability. By evening, the panel announced a brief recess. Everyone expected them to deliberate for hours, perhaps even days. But in a surprising twist, the commissioners reconvened within an hour and delivered their preliminary findings. They deemed the evidence against Hollingsworth credible and overwhelming. They recommended that the state legislature initiate impeachment proceedings, or, alternatively, that the Supreme Court of Michigan exercise its authority to remove him from the bench. It was a stunning outcome, more decisive than most had anticipated. Thunderous applause erupted in the chamber. Hollingsworth's face went ashen. He looked around wildly, as though seeking an escape route. His attorneys urged him to remain calm, but the tension was obvious. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing this final collapse of a man who had once basked in near absolute power over others' fates. Emerging from the courthouse, Aaliyah was met by reporters thrusting microphones in her face. Clamoring for a statement, she spoke with measured composure. "This is not a moment for celebration," she said. "It's a moment for solemn reflection on how one person's prejudices can contaminate the sanctity of justice. May this be the start of meaningful reform, ensuring such abuses never occur again." Her words echoed across social media and the evening news, striking a chord with citizens, both within and beyond Michigan. For many, it was the first sign in a long time that the system might finally be capable of self-correction. Though the impeachment was not yet a done deal, the momentum was nearly unstoppable. The karmic gears were in motion, grinding inexorably toward a just conclusion. In the tumultuous weeks that followed, Hollingsworth attempted one last maneuver to cling to power. He filed an injunction in federal court, claiming that his constitutional rights had been violated, that the entire hearing was a political witch hunt orchestrated by Governor Pearson's office. His legal team pressed for a restraining order to halt any further action against him. But the federal judge reviewing the case swiftly dismissed the motion as baseless, noting that judicial oversight was a cornerstone of democracy, not a violation of it. Back in Lansing, the impeachment hearings proceeded at a brisk pace. Lawmakers from both parties, sensing public outcry against judicial corruption, showed little sympathy for Hollingsworth. Debates in the state legislature were intense, but the outcome was foregone. The evidence was far too substantial and the public mood too incensed. Aaliyah watched these developments from a relative distance. She refocused on her core duties, drafting legislation in partnership with civil rights organizations to expand judicial oversight and provide better training on implicit bias. Her once obscure role was now front and center. She received invitations to speak at law schools and conferences across the nation, sharing her experience of confronting systemic injustices. Though she appreciated the platform, a part of her remained quietly contemplative. The personal toll of the ordeal weighed on her. She had faced threats, invasive scrutiny, and the stress of near-constant media attention. Yet each time she felt the weight of it all, she remembered the voices of those who had come forward: Daniel the clerk, the wronged defendants, the families burdened by unjust rulings. Their courage fueled her own. Governor Pearson publicly praised Aaliyah's perseverance, calling her a model public servant who turned the tide for justice in our state. Meanwhile, commentators across the political spectrum pointed to the saga as a watershed moment. Editorials in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and national news networks declared it an emblem of accountability at a time when skepticism about institutions ran high. Through it all, Hollingsworth's star continued to fall. The final act loomed, and it promised to be definitive, a legislative vote to strip him of his judgeship for good and possibly open the door for criminal charges. Impeachment Day arrived in the grand legislative chamber at the Michigan state capitol. Spectators filled the galleries, anxious to witness the conclusion of a story that had seized the state's attention for months. Outside, throngs of demonstrators gathered with signs reading "Justice for all and no one is above the law." A smaller crowd still protested in favor of Hollingsworth, though their numbers had dwindled substantially. Lawmakers took to the floor, each granted time to speak. Some recounted personal stories of constituents harmed by Hollingsworth's rulings. Others pointed to the myriad pieces of evidence that emerged during the Judicial Tenure Commission hearing. A few hardliners tried to frame the situation as a matter of preserving judicial independence, but the majority dismissed that argument as hollow, given the judge's blatant misconduct. The final vote was tallied, and the result was resounding. An overwhelming majority voted to impeach Hollingsworth, effectively ousting him from the bench. Gasps and cheers erupted simultaneously, relief and triumph mingling in the chamber's charged air. For many, the vote signified a moral victory against corruption, a beacon of hope that the legal system could indeed self-correct. That same evening, Governor Pearson signed an executive order mandating a review of all major cases Hollingsworth had presided over in the past decade. A special commission was tasked with determining if racial bias or improper procedure had tainted the outcomes, and whether those cases warranted re-examination. The news was met with applause from civil rights groups, who recognized the magnitude of the effort required to rectify years of injustice. Standing on the Capitol steps, Aaliyah watched as the crowds reacted to the announcement. Despite the swirl of voices around her, she felt a moment of stillness, a deep sense of fulfillment. Hollingsworth had finally been held accountable. Yet she also understood that the real work was only beginning, unwinding years of harm done to those less fortunate and ensuring no other judge or official would follow the same path of arrogance and bias. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of public announcements, legal appeals, and behind-the-scenes negotiations. Hollingsworth, having been stripped of his position, filed appeals in higher courts to overturn the legislature's decision. Experts widely predicted he would fail. The evidence against him was too damning. Nevertheless, the motions dragged on, requiring administrative resources and taxpayer money. Critics decried it as a vain attempt to salvage a ruined legacy. Outside the domain of high-stakes politics, Aaliyah received letters, emails, and messages from ordinary citizens who had followed her story. Some shared their own experiences of discrimination